The morning of Richard's funeral was colder than it should have been for late October. The Pennsylvania sky hung low and gray, and the wind moved like something that had been waiting for a moment to arrive. I adjusted the neckline of my black dress in the mirror, then paused. I had others nicer ones, but they held memories. This one was new, blank, bought to wear grief like a uniform. The house was too quiet. It had been since the hospice bed left our bedroom, leaving behind indentations in the rug and an ache I couldn't vacuum away. I walked through the front door without waiting for anyone. The kids hadn't arrived yet. They'd texted logistics, sent calendars and confirmations, but none of them had been around much near the end. At the Eternal Light Chapel, Richard lay still in the walnut casket we had chosen a decade ago, when we were still young enough to laugh nervously through end-of-life planning. He looked peaceful, as if the cancer had taken everything, but left him a little dignity on its way out. I sat alone in the front pew, hands clasped around my wedding ring. People filled the chapel, neighbors, old colleagues, church friends, but not the ones I waited for. Then I heard them. Julian's voice came first, low and polished. "Mom," he said, leaning in for a cheek kiss that felt like a press release. "We'll talk after. Just practical matters." Talia followed, sleek and unreadable, holding a leather folio. Gavin brought up the rear, avoiding my eyes. They sat behind me in perfect formation. The service passed in pieces, hymns. I barely heard a eulogy from a pastor who had only met Richard twice. Then Julian stood and walked to the podium. He looked every inch the executive calm, composed, ready to deliver results. "Our father believed in legacy," he began, "in building something that would last. He made it clear to us that what he built, his investments properties, his life's work, should stay in the family." Talia nodded beside him. Gavin said nothing, and he left everything to us. Julian concluded, "Our mother will be well taken care of." From a distance, the words didn't echo. They landed, quiet and final. I didn't speak. I just held the ring tighter, like a memory that still knew how to ache. And I remembered this wasn't the first thing Richard and I had prepared for. It started with a conversation over lukewarm coffee and the sound of distant lawnmowers. Richard had just come in from the garage, wiping his hands on a rag, when he said it, not as a warning, not even as a worry. Just a quiet observation. "They're drifting, Corinne." He didn't have to say who. The names hung between us like dust in the light. Julian had stopped calling unless there was a question about taxes or asset performance. Talia visited on holidays, her eyes always on her phone, fingers twitching with work she wouldn't explain. Gavin. Sweet Gavin showed up now and then with apologies and excuses that landed like soft lies. "They're busy," I said, but even I didn't believe it. Not anymore. We didn't talk about it every day. But that morning he sat across from me and slid a manila folder onto the table. "I've been thinking. I don't want to leave you in their hands, not if they see you as a line item." I opened it slowly. Inside, draft wills, trust outlines, contingencies. A blueprint of foresight. "It feels like betrayal," I whispered. "No," he said. "It's protection. Love shouldn't come with risk." Over the months we made appointments, lawyers, advisors, long meetings where we argued over clause language and power of attorney. We debated everything: monthly amounts, housing, flexibility, penalty structures. Sometimes we laughed about how grim it all sounded. But beneath the legal jargon, we were crafting something fragile and necessary. "There are children," I told him one night. "What does it say about us that we have to write rules to make sure I'm not left behind?" "It says we raise them in comfort," he replied. "And comfort makes people forget." By the time his diagnosis came, we had already signed the documents. The trust was funded. The penalties were clear. I didn't want to believe they'd be necessary. But Richard had looked at me, hollowed by chemo but still sharp, and said, "If you're hearing these words one day and they try to manage you from across a conference table, remember, I left you the tools to flip it back. I remembered that too when I saw the smirk on Julian's face at the reading of the will. The office smelled like paper and polish. James Whitman had represented our family for nearly 15 years. He greeted me first with a small nod that held weight. Then he turned to my children, polite, professional, distant. Julian wore his confidence like cologne, thick and meant to linger. Talia came armed with a leather folio already half filled with notes. Gavin looked tired, his hands twitching near his knees like he wanted to be anywhere else. We sat at a long table, each of them across from me, flanked by ambition and assumption. James cleared his throat. Before we begin, I need to remind everyone that what's outlined here represents Richard Hale's final legally binding intentions. These documents were executed in full compliance with Pennsylvania state law. Julian nodded, like he'd already rehearsed this. The first section confirmed what they expected: the business shares the property, the accounts, everything to be distributed equally among the three of them. Julian smiled. Talia checked a box on her notepad. Gavin didn't move. But then James turned the page. There are, however, explicit conditions tied to these inheritances, he said. The room shifted. Julian leaned forward slightly. Talia froze, pen hovering. First, James continued. Each beneficiary's share is contingent on the full care and support of Mrs. Corinne Hale for the remainder of her natural life. This includes housing of her choice, full medical coverage, and a monthly stipend of no less than $8,000. No one spoke. Gavin blinked. Talia's pen dropped. Julian exhaled once sharp. Second, James said, should any of the beneficiaries attempt to place Mrs. Hale into institutional care against her will or fail to meet these terms, their portion will be forfeited and redirected to pre-named charities. Julian's mouth opened, but nothing came out. Third, James added a separate trust in the amount of $500,000 has been established under Mrs. Hale's sole discretion. I didn't react. I didn't need to. James unfolded a sealed envelope. Richard requested this letter be read aloud. I already knew the first line. My dear children, if you are hearing this, then I am gone, and the truth is now in your hands. James unfolded the paper with care, his hands steady, his voice neutral. But the words he read carried weight like falling stones. My dear children, if you are hearing this, then I am gone, and the truth is now in your hands. I hope you are surprised. I hope you are shocked. Most of all, I hope you finally understand what you chose to overlook. I didn't blink. I'd read the letter before. Richard made me promise I wouldn't stop James from reading it aloud no matter what happened. You speak of legacy as if it were a ledger. But legacy is not just made of numbers and assets. It is also built of hours of sacrifices of silent labor. No one applauds. If you ever believed that I alone built the life you now inherit, then you never truly understood what it cost or who paid. Talia shifted in her seat. Gavin's gaze dropped. Julian kept his jaw tight, his arms folded. Your mother is not an obligation. She is not a leftover. She is the reason there was anything to leave behind. Every deal I made, every risk I took, I could not have done without her faith, her steadiness, and the million unseen things she did to keep our lives intact. You will not discard her while calling it duty. The silence in the room thickened. James read on. I have watched over the years the distance grow. I hoped you would return to her on your own. But if money is the only language you've learned to speak clearly, then let this be your translation. Care is not optional. Proximity matters. And if you are tempted to outsource love, then you are unfit to receive what love built. Julian inhaled sharply, like a punch had landed where he didn't expect. There will come a time when you understand what she carried. I pray it isn't too late. For her sake, I've written protections. For yours, I've left this truth. James paused, then folded the letter and placed it in front of me. I didn't touch it. It had already done its work. No one spoke for a long moment. The room, so eager at the start, now sat heavy with a reckoning they hadn't prepared for. They looked at me differently. Not with respect, not yet, but with something slower and harder to swallow consequence. And I, for the first time since Richard passed, felt something like steadiness return to my breath. The next morning, the calls began. James unfolded the paper with care, his hands steady, his voice neutral. But the words he read carried weight like falling stones. My dear children, if you are hearing this, then I am gone, and the truth is now in your hands. I hope you are surprised. I hope you are shocked. Most of all, I hope you finally understand what you chose to overlook. I didn't blink. I'd read the letter before. Richard made me promise I wouldn't stop James from reading it aloud, no matter what happened. You speak of legacy as if it were a ledger, but legacy is not just made of numbers and assets. It is also built of hours of sacrifices, of silent labor. No one applauds. If you ever believed that I alone built the life you now inherit, then you never truly understood what it cost or who paid. Talia shifted in her seat. Gavin's gaze dropped. Julian kept his jaw tight, his arms folded. Your mother is not an obligation. She is not a leftover. She is the reason there was anything to leave behind. Every deal I made, every risk I took, I could not have done without her faith, her steadiness, and the million unseen things she did to keep our lives intact. You will not discard her while calling it duty. The silence in the room thickened. James read on. I have watched over the years the distance grow. I hoped you would return to her on your own. But if money is the only language you've learned to speak clearly, then let this be your translation. Care is not optional. Proximity matters. And if you are tempted to outsource love, then you are unfit to receive what love built. Julian inhaled sharply, like a punch had landed where he didn't expect. There will come a time when you understand what she carried. I pray it isn't too late. For her sake, I've written protections. For yours, I've left this truth. James paused, then folded the letter and placed it in front of me. I didn't touch it. It had already done its work. No one spoke for a long moment. The room, so eager at the start, now sat heavy with a reckoning they hadn't prepared for. They looked at me differently, not with respect, not yet, but with something slower and harder to swallow consequence. And I, for the first time since Richard passed, felt something like steadiness return to my breath. The next morning, the calls began. The first call came from Julian. Exactly 3 days after the reading, he didn't ask how I was. He opened with a statement. We've drafted a preliminary care structure, he said. Talia, Gavin, and I have agreed to rotate responsibilities. Groceries appointments, home maintenance will divide everything evenly. There was a pause as if waiting for applause. We'll also automate the monthly transfer, he added. First of every month. You won't have to think about it. I didn't respond right away. I stared out the window at the dogwood tree Richard planted the year Gavin was born. The leaves were beginning to curl. That's thoughtful, I said. Finally. Though I'd hardly call remembering your mother once a month a burden. Julian didn't reply. He ended the call by confirming the next check-in would be from Talia. Hers arrived 2 days later in the form of a detailed email attachment, a 14-page document titled Ongoing Parental Support and Monitoring Plan, bullet points, color-coded cells. A line item for emotional check-ins 5 minutes bi-weekly. At the bottom, she'd included a legal disclaimer, subject to amendment pending mutual consent of all parties. I read it twice. Then I deleted it. Gavin's message was shorter. A voicemail. Soft, halting. I'm sorry, Mom. I didn't expect things to be so formal. But I want to help. Just tell me what you need. I didn't call him back. A week later, a box arrived from Talia. Inside a whiteboard calendar, dry erase markers, sticky notes, and a laminated instruction sheet with bolded phrases like joint accountability, TRAS, inheritance protection. It felt like someone had turned motherhood into a quarterly review. The first $8,000 transfer appeared like clockwork. Michael's name on the memo line. No note attached. I withdrew half of it the same day and mailed a check to the literacy nonprofit I used to volunteer with. The other half went untouched. Phone calls came each Sunday. Always on time. Always with the same hollow questions. How's your health, Mom? Need anything fixed around the house? Is your mail coming in regularly? I answered politely, briefly, like a guest in a home I used to own. They were careful. They thought precision would prove love. But there was no softness in their voices, no memory, no laughter, only compliance. I let them go on for a month. Then I decided it was time to test the limits of their structure. It started with the filing cabinets in the basement. I called Julian on a Tuesday morning. I found some boxes your father stored years ago, papers from the early days of the company. They're too heavy for me to lift. Could you come by? He arrived that afternoon in a navy suit, clearly irritated. I had to move a board meeting, he said, though. He never looked directly at me. He followed me down the stairs, the scent of cologne trailing behind him like obligation. The cabinets were exactly where Richard had left them, tall metal and coated in dust. Julian sighed and rolled up his sleeves. He worked for hours. I brought him coffee and said little. By the fifth drawer, he found it the original partnership agreement between Richard and his first investor, a document that hadn't been seen in years. I watched his eyes light up. This changes everything, he murmured. I could restructure the firm, shift control. I stepped closer. What did you just call it? The company, he corrected too quickly. You meant to say, take over, I said, plucking the document from his hand. That night I locked it in the safe. Richard and I had installed behind the linen closet. With Talia, it was easier. I called on a Friday afternoon and asked if she could stop by. I have some insurance paperwork I don't understand, I said. Storm damage and renewal language. You know how confusing these things get. She arrived with her laptop, sat at the kitchen table, and began cross-referencing state codes and company policies. 2 hours in, she'd drafted a 12-page legal memo outlining my options. When she asked to see the claim form, I handed her a blank sheet of paper. There's no dispute, I said. She blinked. Then why I just wanted to understand what you still remembered how to do. She stared at me, stunned. Then quietly packed up her things and left. With Gavin, I didn't need strategy. I just waited for the day. He called on the anniversary of Richard's death and asked if he could come by. I didn't want you to be alone, he said. He arrived in scrubs, smelling faintly of antiseptic and dog fur. We sat at the dining room table flipping through old albums. At one point, he touched a photo of himself as a boy standing on Richard's shoulders. I remember this, he whispered. And I remember everything you did for us. I'm sorry, Mom. I wanted to feel something. I didn't. I watched his face and saw the guilt settle in his shoulders, soft as fog and just as cold. They continued to call. They continued to pay. They continued to try. But what they didn't know was that I had already seen everything I needed to. The money arrives on time first of every month, just as the terms require. Julian's name appears on the transfer. Talia sends her portion quarterly, tightening her already strained budget. Gavin had to sell his house and move into a 2-bedroom apartment to manage his part. They call every Sunday like clockwork. All 3 of them together on speakerphone. The conversation is always the same, polite, shallow, exact. Did the heating bill go up? Have you had your prescriptions refilled? Need anything looked at on the roof? They never forget a question. They never miss a call. But the air between us is hollow, like we're reading from a shared script. Neither of us believes in anymore. I answer them calmly. I thank them. I lie. In those first few months, I watched closely, listening for something real. A crack, a stumble, a word that didn't come from guilt or necessity, but it never came. Now I don't look for warmth. I measure the distance they've chosen, and I let them sit in it. Sometimes Julian sends bakery boxes from places he doesn't remember I stopped visiting. Talia forwards articles about aging with dignity. Gavin mails me photos of his dog, asking if I remember the one we had when he was 7. I remember all of it, and that's the difference. They still hope that structure can replace sincerity, that obligation might one day pass for care. But they're not paying to love me. They're paying to maintain the illusion that they do. And the more they give, the more I see how little it costs them to miss who I was. I remember everything. I remember every fever I sat through with a damp cloth on a child's forehead. Every night, I walked the floor with a colicky baby pressed to my chest. I remember Julian's scraped knees, Talia's spelling bees, Gavin's science fair volcano that exploded across the garage. I remember birthdays with handmade cakes, Halloween costumes stitched in a rush, Christmas mornings where I'd been up since 4. I remember the quiet sacrifices. The job I didn't take because it conflicted with pickup schedules. The vacation I canceled when Gavin had an asthma flare. The things I didn't buy so they could have what they wanted without ever knowing what it cost. And I remember their silence. I remember the dinners where they talked over me, the holidays they skipped, the way they slowly stopped asking me things, stopped trusting me to be anything more than a placeholder for tradition. I remember how they looked at me during the funeral as if I were someone to be moved gently out of the frame, someone to be handled, but not held. They talk to me now like they've remembered something important, but I know better. They're not reaching for me, they're managing liability. And I've stopped offering softness in return. I used to think motherhood was permanent, that love like mine couldn't expire. But I've learned that even devotion, if starved long enough, turns into something else. I still set the table with care. I still keep a drawer of photos they'll never ask to see. I still keep the house warm, but I don't keep space for their return. Because some mothers forget, some forgive, and some, like me, simply remember. Epilogue. The window she didn't close. I sit by the window each morning with the same chipped mug Richard once held the tea, just warm enough to keep the chill back. Outside, the dogwood tree is starting to bloom again. It always did prefer spring to show its full face. Today, the mail brought a card not from my children, but from Lila, the girl who grew up 2 doors down. Inside, her handwriting spilled across the paper, full of warmth. Thank you for every afternoon you let me sit at your kitchen table while Mom worked late. I still remember the cinnamon toast and how safe it felt. I smiled without bitterness. That was real. That was mine. The people we pour into don't always share our name. And sometimes the ones who carry you forward aren't the ones who called you Mom. The checklists still come. The phone calls too. They do their duty, careful and complete. But I don't wait for change anymore. I water the plants. I fold the laundry. I remember. And some mornings I open the window just enough to let the breeze in, because there are still parts of me that aren't locked away.